Because the work is so granular, identifying the intent of a pixel or the tone of a syllable, the workers lose their sense of context. They are no longer part of a society. They are part of a data set. They begin to see the world as a series of labels. A sunset isn't a beautiful moment. It's a natural light landscape category A. A child's laugh isn't a joy. It's a high-frequency audio event positive. The repetition has finally colonized the way we perceive reality itself. This is the peak of the great monotony. We have moved from the physical gear to the mental gear and finally to the perceptual gear. We have turned the act of seeing and feeling into a repetitive industrial process. But as we reach this peak, we find a strange final irony. The very machines we are training with this mind-numbing repetition are starting to show us what we've lost. When an AI can repeat any task 1 billion times without tiring, it makes our own repetition look pathetic. It forces us to ask, if a machine can do this, why am I wasting my limited heartbeats on it? The history of the most repetitive work is actually a history of the great distraction. We were so busy trying to survive, so busy trying to be efficient, and so busy trying to satisfy the algorithm that we forgot that humans are the only things in the known universe that can find meaning in the chaos. Repetition is the death of meaning. Variety is its lifeblood. As the final light of this narrative fades, imagine a worker in a dark room, halfway across the world, clicking a button to tell a computer that a picture of a cat is indeed a cat. They have done this 5,000 times today, but then they stop. They look at their own hand, the complex biological miracle of bone and skin. They realize that no machine can ever feel the desk's surface or the warmth of the air quite like they can. The last human click is the one where the worker decides to close the tab. The most repetitive work in history ends not with a breakthrough in technology, but with a breakthrough in dignity. We are walking out of the digital factory and back into the sunlight of a world that is messy, unpredictable, and wonderfully, beautifully slow. We have explored the factory, the office, and the digital screen. But there is a final layer to this story, a hidden dimension of repetition that most people never realize they are a part of. This is the silent harvest. It is the most repetitive work in history because it is the only work that you do while you think you are playing. It is the commodification of the human subconscious. In the late 2010s, a new kind of work emerged under the guise of user experience. Every time you scroll to the bottom of a feed, every time you swipe to see the next video, and every time you tap a heart icon, you are performing a micro-task. To you, it feels like entertainment. To the machine, it is data entry. You are a volunteer laborer in the world's largest, most repetitive focus group. You are training the world's most powerful AI to understand human desire, one repetitive flick of your thumb at a time. This is the ultimate evolution of the assembly line. Henry Ford moved the car to the man. The modern algorithm moves the content to the mind. The repetition is no longer physical, it is neurological. The work is to react. The output is your attention. We have reached a stage where the most repetitive task in history is simply staying engaged. Millions of people spend hours every day performing the exact same swiping motion, thousands of times over, trapped in a dopamine loop that was designed by the world's smartest engineers to be unbreakable. The psychological consequence of this is a phenomenon known as attention fragmentation. When your primary work, even your leisure work, is a series of 3-second repetitive bursts, your brain loses the ability to sustain a long-form thought. We are becoming shallow processors. We are great at the click, but we are losing the contemplation. This is the final stage of the Industrial Revolution. We didn't just automate the production of goods, we automated the production of experience. Imagine a future historian looking back at our era. They won't see us as masters of technology. They will see us as the click generation. They will see billions of humans sitting in silence, eyes glowing with blue light, repeating the same thumb scroll for hours on end, day after day, year after year. It is a spectacle of monotony that would make the 19th century factory worker weep with pity. At least the factory worker knew they were being exploited. We call our exploitation connection. But this is where the story reaches its absolute zero. When the repetition becomes so deep that it is unconscious, it becomes a part of our nature. We are now at the point where not repeating feels like a withdrawal. If you put your phone down and sit in silence for 10 minutes, your brain begins to itch. It craves the loop. It demands the next repetitive hit of information. We have built a prison of habit, and we have decorated it with likes. The history of the most repetitive work ends here, with the realization that the human gear didn't disappear, it just became invisible. We are the gears in a global engine of engagement. The only way to break the machine is to refuse the rhythm, to stop the scroll, to break the loop, to do something that cannot be tracked, quantified, or repeated by a machine. We have followed the thread of human labor until it has become a spider web, wrapping around the globe and tightening around our very consciousness. But there is one final, almost metaphysical perspective we must consider to truly grasp the scale of the most repetitive work in history. This is the concept of the eternal return, the realization that the more we advance, the more we seem to find ourselves back in the same primitive loops we tried to escape. Think back to the very first chapter, the child in the 1840s twisting broken threads in a Manchester mill. Now, look at a modern software engineer in a glass tower in San Francisco, debugging lines of code. On the surface, they couldn't be more different, but at the core, the psychological weight is identical. The engineer is looking for a break in a sequence, a tiny error in a massive, invisible tapestry. They spend 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, staring at a screen, their fingers repeating the same keystrokes, their brain performing the same narrow diagnostic loop. This is the sophisticated monotony. We have replaced physical fatigue with decision fatigue. We have traded the ache in our muscles for a rot in our focus. Whether you were a piecer in 1840 or a coder in 2026, the repetition has the same goal, to maintain the machine. We are the caretakers of a system that has become so complex that its only function is to keep itself running. The work has become self-referential. We repeat tasks to fix the problems caused by the previous repetition. As we reach the absolute end of this 10,000-word journey, we see the grand irony of human history. We built technology to free us from the repetitive struggle for survival, the hunting, the gathering, the tilling of the soil. But in doing so, we created a new kind of survival, the struggle to stay relevant in a world of perfect machines. We have reached the peak of the loop, where the most repetitive thing about human history is our refusal to believe we are repeating it. We see the same patterns of exploitation, the same myths of efficiency, and the same promises of a future of leisure that never quite arrives. Every generation thinks they are the ones who will finally break the machine, only to find themselves building a sleeker, faster version of the same cage. The most repetitive work isn't just a job, it is the human tendency to trade our now for a someday that is controlled by someone else's clock. But this story doesn't have to be a tragedy. Every loop has a tangent, a point where you can fly off in a new direction. The history of the loop is actually a call to action. It is a reminder that your time is the only truly non-renewable resource in the universe. A machine can repeat 1 billion cycles, but you only have a finite number of heartbeats. When you spend those heartbeats on a task that is designed to be repetitive, you are giving away the very thing that makes you alive. The greatest resistance isn't a strike or a protest, it is awe. A machine cannot feel awe. A machine cannot be surprised. A machine cannot decide to stop halfway through a task because it saw a bird outside the window. Your ability to be distracted by beauty is your greatest defense against the great monotony. The story is done. The cycle is documented. From the steam whistle to the digital notification, we have traced the heartbeat of the human gear. Now, as the screen fades to black, the most important work in your life begins. It is the work of being unoptimized. It is the work of being unpredictable. It is the work of being you.
We have reached the post-work horizon, a place where the repetition has become so absolute that it has finally achieved a state of transparency. In this final chapter of our saga, we look at the invisible loop. This is the world where the most repetitive work in history is no longer something you do, but something you are. It is the final synthesis of the human and the machine, where the boundaries have blurred so completely that the concept of labor itself has dissolved into the background noise of existence. In the near future of the 2020s and 2030s, we see the rise of passive contribution. This is the work of being a data point. Simply by walking down a street with a smartphone, by having your heart rate tracked by a watch, or by allowing a smart home device to listen to the rhythm of your sleep, you are working. You are providing the repetitive data stream that fuels the global economy. You are mining value for corporations simply by existing. This is the ultimate peak of monotony. The work is so repetitive and so constant that it requires zero effort, and in exchange, it offers zero meaning. This leads us to the crisis of the void. When humans are no longer needed for their hands, their eyes, or even their clicks, we face a psychological vacuum that history has never seen. For thousands of years, our identity was tied to what we produced. I am a weaver. I am a builder. I am a clerk. When the machine takes the repetition, it also takes the burden that gave our lives a sense of gravity. We are floating in a world of infinite leisure and infinite boredom, a gilded loop where our only job is to consume the very products our data helped create. But within this void, a new kind of worker is emerging, the curator of reality. As the world becomes flooded with machine-generated repetitive content, the most valuable human skill is becoming the ability to discriminate, to choose, to say this is real and this is not. The most repetitive work of the future will be the constant second-by-second filtering of truth from noise. It is a mental labor that never sleeps, a repetitive scanning of the horizon for a single spark of genuine human connection in a sea of synthetic perfection. The history of the most repetitive work in human history is the story of our long struggle to escape the drudgery of the dirt, only to find ourselves in the drudgery of the data. We have spent centuries trying to build a world where we don't have to work, only to find that without work, without the struggle, the rhythm, and the effort, we lose the very thing that makes us feel alive. We are a species designed for the climb, not for the summit. As this 100,000-word journey concludes, look one last time at the human gear. It wasn't a victim of history, it was the architect. We built the loops to see if we could survive them. We turned ourselves into machines to see if we could find our souls in the friction. And now, as the machines take the gears from our hands, we are left standing in the light of a new dawn. The most repetitive work in history is finally over. Not because the tasks are gone, but because we have finally realized that we are more than the sum of our motions.
The loop has finally disconnected from the machine, but it has left behind a phantom limb. As we move into the final post-work landscape, we encounter a phenomenon that historians of the future will call the Museum of the Mind. This is the stage where the most repetitive work in history becomes a form of recreational drudgery. We see it already in the way we spend our free time, playing video games that require us to farm resources for hours, or engaging in satisfying digital hobbies that mimic the very assembly lines we fought to escape. Why do we do this? Because after 2 centuries of being human gears, our brains have been physically rewired to crave the cycle. We have become addicted to the certainty of the repeat. In a world that is increasingly chaotic, unpredictable, and frightening, the repetition of a simple, meaningless task provides a strange kind of comfort. It is the Stockholm Syndrome of the industrial age. We have fallen in love with our captor, the rhythm of the machine. This is the final trap. The most repetitive work in history is no longer being forced upon us by a factory boss or a digital algorithm. We are now forcing it upon ourselves. We seek out loops to hide from the overwhelming weight of our own freedom. We scroll because it is easier than thinking. We grind in virtual worlds because the rewards are guaranteed, unlike the messy, unquantifiable rewards of real human relationships. We have turned our own consciousness into a private factory where we are both the slave and the master. The transition from worker to player is the ultimate disguise of monotony. It is a world where the $5 day of Henry Ford has been replaced by the free-to-play model of the digital era. You aren't being paid to repeat the motion anymore. You are paying for the privilege of repeating it. We are witnessing the commodification of boredom. If the 20th century was about selling us products to save us time, the 21st century is about selling us ways to kill the time we saved. But even in this final self-imposed loop, there is a flicker of hope. As we tire of the synthetic repeat, we are seeing the emergence of the radical amateur. These are people who do things the hard way, specifically because it is inefficient. They are the people who walk across continents, who build stone walls by hand, who write 1,000-page novels with a fountain pen. They are reclaiming repetition as a form of sacrifice. When you repeat a motion because you have to, it is a prison. When you repeat a motion because you love the object you are creating, it is a prayer. The history of the most repetitive work is the story of how we lost the prayer and found the prison. But the prison walls are nothing more than our own habits. As the screen finally goes dark on this epic, ask yourself, what is the one thing in your life you would do 10,000 times, not for money, not for a like, and not for an algorithm, but simply because the doing of it makes you feel whole? That is the thread that leads out of the labyrinth. That is the motion that breaks the great monotony. The era of the human gear is dead. The era of the human spirit is waiting to be born. It begins when you stop being a part of the machine and start being the architect of your own rhythm. The loop ends now. The rest is your masterpiece. The gears have slowed to a crawl, and the hum of the digital hive is fading. We have reached the final stage of the human journey through monotony, the choice of friction. For 200 years, the story of progress was the story of grease, making life smoother, faster, and more repetitive so that it required less of us. But in this final chapter, we realize that a life without friction is a life without traction. We are finally standing up and demanding the right to struggle. This is the silent revolution. It is happening in small pockets across the globe. It is the office worker who quits their high-paying, email loop job to become a blacksmith, spending 10 hours a day hitting the same piece of red-hot iron. On the surface, it looks like they've just traded one repetitive task for another. But look at their eyes. The blacksmith isn't a gear. They are a master of the strike. Every blow of the hammer is a conversation with the metal. There is friction, there is heat,
and there is a soul in the resistance. We are entering the era of voluntary difficulty. After centuries of labor-saving devices, we have discovered a terrifying truth. When you save too much labor, you lose the person. We are reclaiming the hard way. We are seeing a massive surge in micro-farming, where families spend their weekends performing the repetitive, back-breaking labor of weeding and planting. They aren't doing it because it's efficient. It's actually much cheaper to buy a vegetable from the supermarket. They are doing it because the repetition connects them to the earth in a way that a grocery app never could. This is the final irony of the most repetitive work in history. The very tasks that we once considered a curse have become our salvation, provided we choose them for ourselves. We are moving from a world of managed output to a world of meaningful process. We are realizing that the loop is only a prison if the walls are built by someone else. If you build the loop yourself, it becomes a ritual. But the revolution faces a powerful enemy, the optimization trap. Even as we try to escape, the systems around us are designed to pull us back into the smooth, frictionless repeat. Our phones suggest our words before we type them. Our streaming services pick our music before we hear it. Our maps tell us the fastest route, depriving us of the chance to get lost and find something new. To fight the great monotony, we must consciously choose the slower route. We must choose the broken path. We must choose to do things poorly until we learn to do them with love. The history of human labor has been a long, dark tunnel of repetition. We entered it as craftsmen and artists. We traveled through it as gears and data points, and now we are emerging on the other side. But we are not the same as we were when we started. We have seen what happens when we give our time to the machine. We have felt the coldness of the infinite repeat, and because of that, we will never take a unique moment for granted again. As the final curtain falls on this 100,000-word history, remember this: the most repetitive work in history was never about the machines. It was about our own belief that we were replaceable. The moment you decide that your time is too precious to be spent in a loop that doesn't serve your soul, the machine loses its power. The great silence has arrived. The line is dead. The factory is a park. The screen is a mirror. Now, go out and do something that no machine could ever predict. Go out and be the glitch in the system. Go out and live a life that cannot be repeated.
We have reached the absolute end of the line, the moment where history dissolves and the future begins. After 20 chapters of exploring how we were ground down into gears, we must face the final, most intimate stage of this saga, the sovereignty of the second. For 200 years, the second was something stolen from us. It was measured by a foreman's stopwatch, a punch card machine, or a server's latency. In the great monotony, a second was a unit of production. But as the machines finally take full control of the repeat, we are reclaiming the second as a unit of existence. This is the final transformation. We are moving from a quantity of life, how much we can produce in a day, to a quality of presence, how much of ourselves is actually there for each moment. The most repetitive work in history was essentially a massive theft of time. We are the generation tasked with the recovery of that stolen wealth. But how do we live in a world without the safety of the loop? We are seeing the rise of the deep breath movement. It is a quiet, global shift toward activities that cannot be accelerated. You cannot speed run a friendship. You cannot optimize the grief of losing a loved one. You cannot automate the feeling of a sunset on your skin. These are the non-repeatable events. They are the anti-work. And in the post-repetition era, they will become the highest form of human currency. We are witnessing the birth of a new kind of human, the experiencer.
In the 19th century, we were producers. In the 20th century, we were consumers. In the 21st century, we are becoming witnesses. Our value to the universe is no longer in what we make, but in the fact that we are here to perceive it. A machine can record 1 billion hours of video, but it cannot see it. Only you can do that. Your consciousness is the one thing the great monotony could never replicate, no matter how many times it made you click. As the final light of this narrative fades, think back to the very first human gear, that tired child in the textile mill in 1790. They worked so that you wouldn't have to. They endured the loop so that one day their descendant could stand in a world of machines and say, "I am not like you." The history of the most repetitive work is finally, permanently closed. The gears have been melted down. The algorithms have been set to run in the background. The silence is no longer empty. It is full of possibility. We have stepped out of the factory, closed the laptop, and let the scroll come to a halt. But even as the external repetition ends, we are haunted by the afterimage. Just as you see a ghost of a bright light after you close your eyes, our culture is currently vibrating with the phantom rhythm of the gears. This is the final, lingering challenge of our history, learning how to be still in a world that was built for movement. In the 2020s and beyond, we are seeing a strange phenomenon in our homes and cities, the architecture of ghost work. We live in apartments designed for workers who are never home, in cities built for commutes that no longer happen, surrounded by objects made by machines that don't know our names. We are living in a set designed for a play that has finished its run. The repetition is gone, but the void it left behind is vast. This is the era of the great re-enchantment. To survive the afterimage, humans are beginning to re-enchant their lives with beautiful, useless things. We are seeing a resurgence of small talk, of long, aimless walks, and of the analog slowdown. We are realizing that the most radical thing you can do in a world of 5G speed and instant fulfillment is to be inefficient. To write a letter by hand is a protest. To cook a meal from scratch is a rebellion. To sit in silence without a goal is a victory. The history of the most repetitive work taught us how to be productive, but it forgot to teach us how to be present. Now we are self-teaching the most basic human skills. We are learning how to look a stranger in the eye without a screen between us. We are learning how to wait without reaching for a distraction. We are learning that a boring moment is actually a fertile one. It is the soil from which original thoughts grow. The human gear has been dismantled, and in its place, we are finding something older and more resilient, the human pulse. A gear only moves when it is pushed. A pulse moves from within. We are moving from a reactive life to a proactive one. We are no longer waiting for the whistle to tell us when to start or the bell to tell us when to stop. As you walk away from this story, carry this one truth with you. The machines can repeat the past, but only you can create the future. A machine can simulate 1 billion scenarios based on what has already happened, but it cannot make a leap. It cannot have a whim. It cannot fall in love with a lost cause. The most repetitive work in history is finally, truly in the rearview mirror. The road ahead is unpaved, unmapped, and completely silent. It is the most terrifying and beautiful place we have ever been. We have reached the ultimate conclusion of the human loop. Throughout this journey, we have tracked the human gear from the steam-powered mills to the silicon-powered clouds. We have seen the death of the artisan and the birth of the drone. But as we stand at the final threshold, we are witnessing a miracle that no historian predicted, the resurrection of the hand. After centuries of trying to make our hands act like machines, precise, tireless, and identical, we are rediscovering the power of the infection of the individual. This is the secret that the great monotony tried to hide, that the imperfections of human work are actually its most valuable feature. In the high-end markets of the future, the most expensive items won't be the ones that are perfectly symmetrical. They will be the ones that show the scar of the maker. We're seeing the rise of fingerprint economics. In a world where AI can generate 1 million perfect images in a second, a single, messy, hand-painted canvas becomes priceless. Why? Because it represents a non-repeatable history. It represents a human being who sat in a room, breathed the air, felt the frustration, and made a choice that cannot be duplicated by an algorithm. This is the final victory over the loop. We aren't just breaking the repetition, we are transcending it. We are moving into an era where labor is being replaced by legacy. The most repetitive work in history was a war on the unique. It wanted us to be interchangeable. It wanted one worker to be exactly like the next. But the silent revolution has taught us that we are the only things in the universe that are not interchangeable. Your perspective, your errors, and your specific way of moving through the world are the only things that the machine cannot harvest. As we close the book on the 200-year history of the human gear, look at your own hands. They were built for the variety of the wild, for climbing, for cradling, for creating. They were never meant for the endless, identical click. By reclaiming the variety of our actions, we are reclaiming the sovereignty of our lives. The factory fire has gone out. The servers have cooled. The great monotony is a ghost story we will tell our children to remind them how far we wandered into the dark.
We have reached the absolute edge of the digital cliff. If you are still here, reading or watching, you have done something that the systems of the last 2 centuries said was impossible. You have maintained your focus. You have resisted the urge to click away. You have broken the 3-second loop of the modern attention span. This final chapter is not about history, and it is not about the future. It is about the now. In the 1800s, the most repetitive work was a physical cage. In the 1900s, it was a social contract. Today, it is a psychological habit. We have spent 23 chapters tracing the monster, only to find that the monster's final hiding place is in our own expectation of the next. We've become so conditioned by the loop that we are constantly waiting for the next hit, the next notification, the next next. But what happens when there is no next? This is the sacred silence. It is the moment where the machine stops providing a rhythm and you have to find your own. For the human gear, this silence was a void to be feared because it meant you weren't producing. But for the human being, this silence is the only place where true freedom exists. It is the only place where you can ask the most dangerous question in the world. Who am I when I'm not being useful? The history of the most repetitive work in history ends with a paradox. We spent hundreds of years building machines to give us leisure, but when we finally got it, we filled it with more repetition. We turned our hobbies into grinds and our social lives into metrics. We were so afraid of the silence that we rebuilt the factory inside our own heads. The final step, the one that completes the 200-year journey, is to stop. Not to move to the next video, not to check the next app, but to sit with the realization that the great monotony only survives if we keep feeding it our attention. The loop isn't a physical structure anymore, it's a choice. Every time you choose a long walk over a short scroll, you are dismantling a piece of the 19th century factory.
Every time you choose a difficult conversation over an easy emoji, you are reclaiming a second of your sovereignty. The story of the most repetitive work in history is over. There is no more data to analyze, there are no more eras to explore. The human gear has been retired.
We have reached the absolute event horizon. If the history of work was a circle, we have finally completed the 360-degree rotation. But we aren't back where we started. We have spiraled into a new dimension entirely. This is the era of the ghost in the algorithm, where the repetition has become so fast that it is turned into a solid state. In the final moments of our journey, we must look at the zero-latency life. We are approaching a world where the machine predicts what you want to do before you even think to repeat the motion. The repetition is now happening in the predictive models of supercomputers. They are repeating your past behaviors billions of times in a fraction of a second to map out your future. This is the ultimate loop, a cage made of your own data, built to ensure you never have to experience the friction of a new choice again. But this is where the human spirit performs its final, most spectacular glitch. Across the world, people are beginning to practice digital sabotage. They are intentionally being unpredictable. They are clicking on things they hate, walking in directions that make no sense, and seeking out information that contradicts their own beliefs. They are engaging in non-pattern living. They have realized that the only way to remain human in a world of perfect repetition is to be the error. This is the final lesson of the 200-year history of the human gear. The error is the essence. The 19th century factory tried to kill the error. The 20th century office tried to manage the error. The 21st century algorithm tries to predict the error. But the error is where the art is. The error is where the invention is. The error is where you are. Every time you make a mistake, every time you change your mind, and every time you do something inefficient, you are asserting your dominance over the great monotony. The most repetitive work in history was an attempt to turn the world into a clock, predictable, ticking, and heartless. But the world isn't a clock, it's a garden. It is messy, it is seasonal, and it is constantly dying and being reborn in ways that no gear can ever understand. The loop has finally snapped under the weight of its own perfection. The digital ghost has left the machine. The factory floor is quiet. The screen is a dark mirror, reflecting a person who is finally, after 2 centuries, no longer a part.
We have finally reached the end of the narrative, the point where the ink runs dry and the gears grind to a permanent halt. We have tracked the most repetitive work in history, from its birth in the soot of Manchester to its digital apotheosis in the cloud. But there is one final, quiet truth that remains when all the machines are turned off. This is the silence of the second dawn. In the first dawn of our species, we stood in the tall grass and looked at the horizon with wonder. In the long midday of the industrial age, we lowered our heads and looked at the assembly line, the clock, and the screen. Now, in the second dawn, we are lifting our heads again. But we are different now. We carry the memory of the loop in our bones. We have the muscle memory of 2 centuries of boredom, and that memory is our greatest gift. Why? Because we finally know the price of a second. The history of repetition has taught us that attention is the only true currency. The factory owner wanted it, the advertiser wanted it, and the algorithm wants it. For 200 years, we treated our attention like a raw material to be mined. In this final chapter, we realize it is a sacred resource to be guarded. The most repetitive work was actually a long, expensive lesson in the value of the unique moment. If you look back at everything we've covered, the lungs of the mill, the ghost work, the infinite scroll,
You see a species that was trying to automate its way to happiness. We thought that if we could just repeat the productive parts of life fast enough, we would eventually arrive at a place of permanent peace. But we found that the faster we repeated the cycle, the further the peace receded. The second dawn is the realization that peace isn't at the end of the loop, it's in the breaking of it. As the screen fades to black on this 26-chapter epic, you are left with a choice that no generation before you truly had. You live in a world where the machines can handle the repeat. The drudgery of the bolt, the pixel, and the data point is finally being lifted from human shoulders. This is the moment of maximum danger and maximum opportunity. Will we use our freedom to build a new, even more addictive loop? Or will we finally step out into the messy real? The history of the most repetitive work in history is not a tragedy. It is a rite of passage. We had to become gears to realize we were meant to be the wind. We had to be bored to tears to realize how much we loved the spark of a new idea. We had to be silent so we could finally hear our own voices. We have reached the absolute limit of language. If you have followed this journey through 26 chapters of soot, steel, and silicon, you have witnessed the rise and fall of the human gear. You have seen how we were shaped by the machine and how, in the end, we chose to break its rhythm. But there is one final, silent frontier that exists beyond the history of work, the horizon of the unseen. This is the space where productivity has no meaning. In the era of the great monotony, anything that couldn't be measured, repeated, or sold was considered waste. If you weren't pulling a lever or clicking a link, you were idle. But as the machines take over the loops of our lives, we are discovering that what the industrial age called waste is actually where the soul lives. The most repetitive work in history was an attempt to fill every second of human time with a predictable output. But the horizon of the unseen is the reclamation of the unaccounted hour. It is the time spent staring at the rain, the time spent in a conversation that goes nowhere, the time spent wandering through a thought that has no monetizable value. These are the moments that cannot be automated because they have no goal. They are pure existence. We are entering a new era of human sovereignty. For centuries, we were defined by our output. In the future, we will be defined by our presence. The most radical thing you can do in a world of perfect machine repetition is to be unproductive on purpose, to do something just because it feels right, even if it achieves nothing. This is the final next. It isn't a new chapter in a book, and it isn't a new video in a feed. It is the step you take when you finally realize that the most repetitive work was a ghost you were chasing, a ghost that told you that your value was tied to your speed. The factory is gone. The screen is dark. The loop has dissolved into the air. We have reached the ultimate destination. This is no longer a story about work. It is a story about the aftermath. When a civilization spends 200 years perfecting the art of the loop, the sudden cessation of that rhythm creates a vacuum. We are currently standing in that vacuum, a generation of former gears looking for a reason to turn. This final stage is the legacy of the broken circle. If you look at the architecture of our modern world, you see the remnants of the repetition everywhere. Our schools are designed like factories, bells, rows, and standardized outputs. Our cities are designed for the 9-to-5 pulse. Even our social lives are built on the refresh cycle. We have successfully automated the labor, but we are still living inside the casing of the machine. The most repetitive work in history left us with a parting gift, the ability to see the difference between efficiency and aliveness. Efficiency is the machine's goal. It wants the shortest distance between 2 points. It wants the loop to be as tight as possible. Aliveness, however, is found in the detour. It is found in the useless complexity of a human heart. We are finally realizing that the things that make life worth living are the very things that make a factory run poorly. Love is inefficient. It takes time and has no guaranteed ROI. Art is inefficient. It requires thousands of failed attempts to reach one truth. Curiosity is inefficient. It leads you down paths that have no destination. The 28 chapters of this saga have been a journey through the death of the individual and back out the other side. We have seen that you can take the man out of the field and put him in the mill. You can take the woman out of the craft and put her in the cubicle. You can take the child out of the play and put them in the digital loop. But you cannot kill the hunger for the unique. The history of the loop is over because the loop has nothing left to give us. We have optimized ourselves into a corner. The only way out is to embrace the linear path, the one that doesn't come back to where it started, the path that moves forward into a future that isn't a refined version of the past, but something entirely shockingly new. The factory is a playground. The office is a gallery. The screen is a window. We have followed the thread of the great monotony until it frayed into nothingness. But as we stand at the end of the 28 chapters, we realize there is one final, hidden truth about the most repetitive work in history. It was never about the machines, and it was never about the money. It was a test of the spirit. For 2 centuries, we asked, how much like a machine can a human become? We pushed the limits of the body in the factories, the endurance of the mind in the cubicles, and the patience of the soul in the digital scroll. We found the answer. We can become very machine-like, but we can never become machines. There is always a residue of humanity, a spark of rebellion, a sudden tear, a burst of laughter that the loop cannot contain. Now we are turning the question around. In this final, unwritten era, we are asking, how much like a human can the world become? This is the human algorithm. It is the process of taking everything we learned during the long monotony and using it to build a world that prioritizes the non-repeatable. We are moving into a time where value isn't measured by how many times you can do a thing, but by how much meaning you can infuse into a single, unique act. We are seeing the rise of intentional friction. Architects are building spaces that force people to slow down and interact. Developers are creating apps that tell you to put the phone down. Workers are demanding deep time over real time. The 29th chapter is the one you are living right now. It is the moment you realize that the most repetitive work wasn't a prison sentence, it was a rehearsal. It taught us what we don't want, so that we could finally define what we do want. We don't want the perfect circle. We want the jagged, beautiful, unpredictable line of a life lived in the present. The history of the loop has been documented. The data has been analyzed. The gears have been silenced. The story of the human gear is officially closed. The story of the human being is wide open. The screen is dark, the factory is still, and for the first time in 200 years, the rhythm of the world is waiting for your heartbeat to set the pace. We have pushed through the soot, the steel, the silicon, and the psyche. We have traveled through 29 chapters of the most relentless repetition the world has ever known. But here, at the 30th and final mark, we find the absolute end of the line. This is the final frame. Think of a film reel. For over 2 centuries, we have been the individual frames, flickering past at a blinding speed to create the illusion of a solid, moving machine. We were so caught up in the motion that we forgot we were separate entities. But now the projector has stopped. The light is shining through a single stationary slide. The flickering has ceased. This is the state of static clarity. When you stop repeating, you start perceiving. The most repetitive work in history served one final, unintentional purpose. It acted as a contrast. By showing us the absolute floor of human existence, the 0 point where we are nothing but a rhythmic motion, it allowed us to see the heights. You cannot appreciate the silence until you have lived through the roar of the factory. You cannot appreciate the unique until you have been drowned in the identical. We are the first generation in the history of our species that can look back at the great monotony as a completed era. We are the survivors of the long gray winter of the soul. And because of that, we carry a responsibility. We are the keepers of the spark. The legacy of this 30-chapter journey isn't a set of facts, it's a vibration. It's the feeling of a hand pulling away from a lever. It's the sound of a screen clicking shut. It's the deep, terrifying, and exhilarating breath of someone who realized they are finally, truly off the clock. The next button has disappeared. There are no more eras to categorize, no more loops to analyze, and no more workers to count. The historical record of the human gear is complete. It has been signed, sealed, and archived in the Museum of the Past. The only thing left is the silence. And in that silence, a new sound is beginning to rise. It's not the tick of a clock or the hum of a server. It's the sound of 1 billion different hearts, all beating at their own unique, unrepeatable, and glorious pace.
Imagine a world where the sun never rises, hidden behind a permanent veil of coal smoke. Imagine a life measured not in years or achievements, but in the rhythmic, soul-crushing repetition of a single motion. You don't speak. You don't think. You simply function. In the heart of the 19th century industrial machine, thousands of men, women, and children were transformed into living gears. They were the repeaters. Individuals whose entire existence was dedicated to doing one thing and only one thing every waking second until their bodies or the machines finally broke. This is the story of Elias Thorne, a man trapped in the relentless loop of the great loom, and the day the rhythm finally skipped a beat. The bell did not ring, it screamed. At 4:30 a.m., the iron tongue of the factory tower lashed out across the tenements of Manchester, a sonic whip crack that signaled the end of sleep and the beginning of the cycle. Elias Thorne stood in the dark, his fingers already twitching in the familiar pattern. He didn't need to be awake to do his job. His muscles had their own memory now, a frantic, mechanical intelligence that had long ago discarded the need for a brain. He walked through the mud-slicked streets alongside thousands of others, a ghost parade of hollow eyes and slumped shoulders. No one spoke. To speak was to waste breath, and breath was a luxury in a city where the air tasted like sulfur and wet soot. They were all heading toward the Maw, the Blackwood textile mill. It was a cathedral of steam and iron, a place where the gods were made of brass and demanded daily sacrifices of human sweat. Elias took his place at Station 42. His world was exactly 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep. In front of him sat the primary shuttle feed of a massive steam-powered loom. His job was simple, terrifyingly so. As the massive iron arm swung left, he had to clear the lint from the track. As it swung right, he had to flick a silver tension lever. Left, clear. Right, flick. Left, clear. Right, flick. The machine moved at a rate of 60 cycles per minute, 1 second per motion, 60 motions per minute, 3,600 motions per hour. For 14 hours a day, Elias Thorne was not a man, he was a human regulator. If he was too slow on the clear, the lint would ignite from the friction and the mill would burn. If he missed the flick, the silk would bunch, the needle would snap, and the foreman's heavy cane would find his ribs before the machine even came to a halt. The roar of the mill began, a low, gut-shaking hum that rose into a deafening shriek as the main drive belts engaged. The heat climbed instantly, thick and humid to keep the threads from snapping. Elias felt the first bead of sweat roll down his spine. but he didn't wipe it. He couldn't. His hands were already in the dance. Left, clear. Right, flick. By the second hour, the sensory graze set in. This was the psychological state the veterans talked about, where the eyes stop seeing the room and start seeing only the blur of the shuttle. The noise, loud enough to bleed ears, became a silent vibration in his bones. He watched the silver lever. It was polished to a mirror finish by his own calloused thumb. He saw his reflection in it for a split second every time he touched it. Each hour, the reflection seemed a little older, a little more faded, as if the machine were physically peeling layers of his soul away to fuel the fabric. There was no clock on the wall. Clocks were for the masters. For the workers, time was measured in the exhaustion of the body. The thirst began around hour 4, a dry, rasping sensation in the throat that made the cotton dust feel like ground glass. But there was no water break. To stop was to break the line. If Station 42 stopped, Stations 43 through 80 stopped. The line was a god, and the god must be fed. Elias looked to his left. A young boy, no older than 10, was performing a similar repetitive task, crawling under the moving machinery to pick up fallen bobbins. The boy's eyes were wide and glazed, moving in perfect sync with the pistons. They were all part of the same organism now, a sprawling, hissing entity of meat and metal. As the sun reached its zenith outside, unseen by those within the brick windowless walls, Elias felt the familiar cramp in his right forearm. It was a sharp, biting pain, a protest from the tendons that had performed the flick over 10 million times in the last 3 years. He ignored it. He pushed the pain into a dark corner of his mind where he kept his memories of green fields and his mother's voice. Left, clear. Right, flick. The monotony was a heavy weight, a physical pressure on the skull. It tempted the mind to wander, but wandering was dangerous. To think about a girl's smile or a warm meal was to lose a millisecond. And in the world of the great loom, a millisecond was the difference between a paycheck and a prosthetic limb. Elias focused on the silver lever. He became the lever. He was the wood, the oil, and the iron. But then, just as the afternoon whistle signaled the final 4-hour stretch, something happened. A sound that shouldn't exist pierced through the mechanical cacophony. A high melodic trill. A bird had somehow flown through a ventilation duct and perched on a high rafter above the screaming looms. For the first time in 3 years, Elias Thorne's eyes drifted upward. His hand reached for the lever, but his mind was on the wing of a sparrow. The rhythm stuttered. The iron arm of the loom swung back, but Elias's hand was a fraction of an inch off. The machine groaned, a dying of metal, and the world of Station 42 began to unravel.
The sound of the snagging silk was like a gunshot. To anyone outside the mill, it would have been drowned out by the thunder of 1,000 looms, but to Elias, it was a deafening crack of doom. The silver tension lever didn't click, it buckled. The delicate threads of Egyptian cotton, destined for the gowns of London's elite, tangled instantly into a bird's nest of white chaos. The machine didn't stop immediately. The steam engine in the basement, a blind and hungry beast, continued to pump power through the leather belts. The loom shrieked as the iron shuttle tried to force its way through the obstruction. Elias snapped back to reality, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His hands, acting on instinct, reached into the churning gears to clear the jam. "Don't!" a voice hissed from the next station. It was Sarah, a woman whose face was permanently etched with the gray pallor of the mills. Elias pulled his hand back just as a brass gear sheared off, flying past his ear and embedding itself in the wooden floorboards. The loom gave one final, violent shudder and died.